comfortably. I know I am. It's story time. Yes, it's another of my What If Horus Heresy videos. This week I want to dive into one of my favourite pairings from the Horus Heresy, Fulgrim and Ferrus Mannus, or, as they're also known, the Phoenix and the Gorgon. These were a classic pairing from the Horus Heresy, the gruff, rough, Iron Hands Primarch, and the glamorous and perfect and pretty Emperor's Children Primarch. An unlikely pairing, you would say, but perhaps one of the strongest pairs of brothers within the Horus Heresy narrative. We all know, hopefully we all know, if you're watching this video, what happened, unfortunately, to that brotherhood. Fulgrim was seduced by the power of chaos, won over by a demon prince of Slaanesh, eventually taken over by the power of Slaanesh, and unfortunately decapitated his beloved brother, going mad for a while in the process, and eventually just fully giving himself over to chaos to become the many-limbed, snake-bodied vision of perfection that we all know and love today. What I want to ask you, though, is what if things had gone slightly differently? We all know that Fulgrim's eventual fall to Slaanesh was tied to his quest for perfection. But what if it had not been Fulgrim that was on this fool's errand? What if instead it had been Ferrus Mannus that had been seduced by the power of chaos? That's what I want to talk to you about today. So, I'm not going to go back over the original stories of either. I'm not going to talk about Ferrus's rise to prominence on the plains of Medusa, his conquering of the clans there, or even how he got his iron hands. Nor am I going to talk about the early days of Fulgrim on Chemos. Where I want to pick up my version of the story is here. Fulgrim, as we know, was offered the Layer Blade, a blade that essentially was a big shiny silver sword with a purple stone in the hilt that was possessed by a demon prince of Slaanesh. He was warned against going down the path that he went down by Eldrad Ulthuan and the Eldar, and he rejected that and in fact killed one of the avatars of Cain in single combat using the Layer Blade. But what if he had listened? What if he had heeded the warnings of the Eldar and had instead rejected chaos? What instead would have happened? Beyond that, what of Ferrus Mannus? As I say, he had got his iron hands early on in his rise to power on Medusa, and when he was reunited with his legion, the Iron Tenth, they very quickly began to emulate their gene father by lopping off one of their hands and having it replaced by a bionic augmetic. This was a cause for some concern to Ferrus Mannus. He, in fact, perceived it as a weakness. Ferrus is always famous for having said the flesh is weak, the implication being therefore it should be replaced. What few consider is the true implications of what he was trying to say in that message. The flesh is weak and should be mastered, rather than replaced, rather than giving in to temptation and obsession, replacing more and more of their flesh with bionics. We know now from some of the Horus Heresy novels that what Ferrus was actually trying to say was that his legion was weak in giving in to their obsession and copying him. And that instead, what he had hoped, once the Great Galactic Crusade was over, once the heresy, when it happened, was over, what he had hoped was that he would find a way to strip the living metal from his hands as a demonstration to his sons of what he was actually trying to teach them. What if that quest then for true genetic perfection had happened earlier? What if, on the one hand, Fulgrim, before he was tempted by the Layer Blade, had met with Ferrus, met with his brother, and had listened to Ferrus's concerns, had listened to Ferrus confiding in his dearest brother, the Phoenician, his worries about his legion, and the two of them had concocted a plan. In the same forges on Terra, deep below what would become the Emperor's Palace, where they had forged their great weapons, Forgebreaker and Fireblade, what if the two Primarchs had conspired together in secret to devise a way to strip that Necrontyr living metal from Ferrus's hands? using the tremendous tools that they had available there, using perhaps the finest forge, the Emperor's own forge. They had hammered and heated and stripped, and no doubt through great pain and agony on Ferrus's behalf, they had successfully plied that living steel from his limbs and destroyed it. What would Ferrus be left with? In a perfect world, you would hope that this had resulted in him having his own two biologically perfect hands restored. That he would become the Primarch that he would have been had he not been tainted by the Xenos metal that he encountered during his great battle against the dragon on Medusa. Instead, what he was left with was the burned and scarred remains of the great conflict he had fought all those decades ago. Ferrus killed the great snake on Medusa by plunging it into liquid rock, holding it beneath the surface of the lava and melting it until such time as it was destroyed. And he succeeded. But you can't, even a superhuman, a transhuman being like a Primarch cannot hold his limbs beneath the surface of the molten power of a world itself and bear no scars. Stripped of the metal that had augmented his damaged limbs, he was left not crippled, but not whole, shall we say. Before, his legion had been known as the Iron Hands. Instead, in time, their name was changed, in many circles at least, to the Withered Hand. A melancholy overtook Ferrus after that, a sickness of the mind, you might say. His grand ambition to reforge his legion in his example in the Emperor's forge had backfired upon him catastrophically. But all was not lost. As I say, genetic perfection, that was the goal. Certainly something that Fulgrim and his own legion had strived for. Perhaps something, despite their very different demeanours, the two brothers had in common. And so Fulgrim turned to his chief apothecary Fabian. We all know what became of him. And sought some way to restore his brother, to undo the damage that had been caused, that he perhaps felt some degree of responsibility for. Cloned flesh, then, was grafted from Ferrus's own DNA in secret, without the knowledge of any of their brother Primarchs or the Emperor. Cloned flesh of Ferrus's own blood, plied over the top of his withered arms to make him whole. And for a time it worked. But Fabian, for all his genius, was not the Emperor. And his repairs, shall we say, proved to be only temporary. Not to be thwarted, though, they tried again, flying new flesh to Ferrus's arms. But each time the grafts were applied, they lasted just that little bit less time. Frustration turned to anger, turned to resentment in Ferrus's heart. A rift was formed between the Phoenix and the Gorgon. And it's in this time that Chaos, perhaps thinking it the ideal moment to strike, sought to tempt the Phoenician with the Layer Blade. But seeing what had happened to his brother in his quest for perfection, and hearing the words of the Eldar and the salutary example they pointed to, was enough for Fulgrim to deny Slaanesh, to shatter the Layer Blade over his knee, dispelling the demon into the warp and seeing firsthand the danger that it posed. Thwarted in their efforts to corrupt the Phoenix, the Chaos Gods turned their intention instead to the Gorgon. Ferrus Mannus, often described by the Primarch Reboot Guilliman as one of the dauntless few, the Primarchs which he said, if he had by his side, no force in the galaxy could stop them. When the War Master Sanguinius turned against their father and consulted with his trusted brother Rebute, Ferrus's name was high up on the list of those that they should seek to turn to their side. In the skies above Istvan III, the legions plotted, and those who would not turn against the Emperor's light were instead destroyed on the surface of Istvan III. But, not to be undone, the Imperium dispatched a mighty fleet of Primarchs, as we know, to Istvan V, where the traitor Primarchs now were making their lair. Fulgrim was amongst the warriors dispatched to bring his traitorous brothers to heel. Already he feared what he would find when he arrived there, warned as he had been of the danger of chaos. And on the plains of Istvan V, the Phoenix and the Gorgon met once more. But Ferrus was already changed from the brother that Fulgrim once knew. A strange, dread vitality filled him. Rather than turning from his withered limbs, he seemed to have embraced them, scarifying his flesh further. The skin on the surface of what had been his withered, scarred arms, now festering and filled with an unnatural vitality. There, on the surface of Istvan V, in the midst of this ginormous conflict, the two of them fought. Fulgrim with the fireblade that had been forged for his brother Ferrus. Ferrus with Forgebreaker, the weapon which Fulgrim had forged for him. In the midst of the conflict, Fulgrim pleaded with Ferrus to turn from the path that he had chosen. When he saw that his brother would not be swayed, he made the ultimate choice, and swinging that burning blade, he decapitated his brother. Or so he thought, for a Primarch is not so easily slain. Though mortally wounded, Ferrus clung to that unnatural life that seemed to fill him, and bringing Forgebreaker round in a titanic blow, he shattered Fulgrim's body. Both Primarchs dropped seemingly lifeless to the blood-soaked ashes of Istvan V, and as the other Primarchs fought a desperate holding action against their traitorous brothers, Fulgrim's legion, his Phoenix Guard, sought to carry their fallen Primarch's body from the field. That, then, you would think, would be the tragic end of their story. But not in my world. As I say, a Primarch is not so easily undone. And the dread vitality that filled Ferrus, the blessings, as you may have guessed, of Father Nurgle, were not to be denied. Ferrus's wounds, when he was next seen, were seemingly healed, but his body more heavily bloated with the power of chaos. A patina of rust now coating the iron parts of his plate. Strange liquids and oils seeping from mechadendrites. And such secrets he had to teach the followers of Mechanicus, who had joined him in this conflict. The Iron Hands were then henceforth known across the Imperium as the Dead Man's Hands, though they themselves changed their name to that sobriquet that had been implied mockingly on them, the Withered Hands, or simply the Withered. Not all of Ferrus's sons accepted their father's new path. At the Battle of Istvan III, Shadrach Meduson turned against the path that he saw his Primarch going down, even though Ferrus had had absolute confidence on him. And it was Shadrach that carried word of the betrayal at Istvan III back to Terra. What of Fulgrim? What of his legion? Well, in the aftermath of the heresy, the Imperium were overjoyed by what is described by some as the first miracle, or the first return of the Phoenix. When the traitor legions were driven back into that great warp storm, the Eye of Terror, it was with a newly reborn Fulgrim at the head of the avenging legions that drove them before it. The Scouring, as it was known, was led by this seemingly revitalized and reborn Phoenix. For over 200 years, Fulgrim led the war against the traitor legions until there wasn't a single traitor stronghold left in the galactic plane outside the Eye of Terror. And then finally, in single combat with the now demonic form of his one-time brother, Ferrus Mannus, Fulgrim was once more brought low by a swing of what had once been a mighty warhammer, but was now a colossal scythe. This still was not the end of their story, though. 2,000 years later, when the beast arose on what had once been Ullanor and once more tried to crush the galaxy under the Orc boot heel, the Imperium turned their eyes to the Emperor's children in their successor chapters. And it was from their ranks that once more the Phoenix returned from the ashes to lead the Imperium against the Orcish horde and bring it to heel. In single combat with the beast on the plains of Ullanor, his own warriors saw Fulgrim seemingly decapitated, even as he drove a death blow into the Orc warlord's heart. And yet, less than 2,000 years later, he returned once more in the Imperium's greatest hour of need. 8 times now has the Phoenix been reborn when required. Seemingly a miracle, some would say, and certainly the disciples of Lorgar and his chapters would have the Imperium believe that that is the source of the seemingly miraculous return, again and again, of one of the Emperor's most beloved sons. Sadly, a darker secret lies within this dark millennium. As I say, Fabian was not the master of the genetic that the Emperor, his grandsire, once was, but he was still, to all intents and purposes, a genius. His efforts to clone replacement flesh for the Gorgon's arms were unsuccessful. But that didn't mean he stopped trying. And after their Primarch was brought low by his brother on the plains of Istavan V, his body carried back to his battlecruiser, entrusted to the Apothecarian, Fabian knew that this was his chance to give hope back to his legion. It took him decades, certainly to the end of the Great Galactic Civil War, before he finally succeeded. But a perfect clone of Fulgrim was born from his laboratories, and only the inner circle of the Legion were entrusted with this knowledge. Fulgrim himself, the reborn Fulgrim, was not told that he was a clone. Instead, truly believing himself to be the resurrected fallen Primarch, he was clad in the dead Primarch's panoply and sent forth to lead the Scouring. And after he fell again at Ferrus's hand, the secrets of the generation of a Fulgrim clone were entrusted to the Master Apothecarian for the Emperor's children and their successor chapters, going down the ages. Fabian was not the genius that his grandsire was, and sadly the clones, while seemingly perfect, are not. Just as the flesh that was grafted to Ferrus Mannus' arms eventually failed, so too are each clone of the Phoenix destined to burn out and fail. This secret is entrusted to only the inner circle of the Emperor's Children chapter and their successor chapters, such as the Palatine Blades or the Flights of the Phoenix. This inner circle of the chapters is known as the Phoenix Guard, seemingly an honour guard standing ready for whenever the Primarch returns to them, to guard him, to stand at his side and fight the darkest threats that face the Imperium. The true secret that they guard, though, is the secret itself. And although 8 times Fulgrim has returned to fight the enemies of the Imperium, on 3 of those occasions, it was his own bodyguards that eventually killed him before his body could decay or corrupt or mutate, and then burned the remains to preserve the legacy of their gene father. This then is the dark secret that the Emperor's Children chapter and their successor chapters carry within them. A secret not even known to the bulk of their line warriors. A secret not even known by Ferrus Mannus, who cannot understand how no matter how many times he kills his brother, Fulgrim returns again and again to confront him with his greatest sin, his fratricide, and his shame. And so their battle continues into the 42nd millennium now. The Phoenix and the Gorgon, the corrupt sons of the Withered Hand, and the noble line of the Emperor's Children. Of those who lived in those early dark days of the Great Crusade and the Great Civil War, one still remains. The oldest living space marine. It's now entombed inside a dreadnought sarcophagus and only awakened when his Primarch returns to serve by his side. The last of the first Phoenix Guard. Called by some Lucius the Eternal. As I did before, I've painted a couple of models up just to kind of match the narrative that I'm working on here, so I'm going to throw those up now. First of all, here is one of the Flights of the Phoenix chapter. I decided I'd do a Primaris Marine for this. It's one of the freebies that was given away by Games Workshop as a freebie Sternguard model. What I've done here is I've painted the tabard black to represent the fact that at this point in time, whilst this warrior is serving, Fulgrim is dead, as far as they are concerned. He is in ashes, and hence the ashen colour of the tabard. And this is something I figured would carry across each of the successor chapters in kind of honour and mourning of their fallen Primarch. When he returns, it's bright white. When the Primarch walks the galactic plane once more, then the warriors would don a more lively panoply to celebrate the return of their Primarch. And another great miracle, as the bulk of the warriors see it. I've stuck the Emperor's Children symbol on the right shoulder pad. I figured that they would still pay homage to their Primarch and to their original legion. So the normal way I've decided that these chapters bear their heraldry as they wear the Emperor's Children's chapter badge on the right shoulder pad, and then their own chapter pad, which in this case is a flying phoenix head, a winged phoenix head, on their left shoulder pad, their chapter symbol, and then company markings and so forth worn in varying locations, knee pads, shins, and so forth. The next one I've painted up then is the alternative, which is what if the Iron Hands had become the Plague Marines, so the Withered Hand, as I decided to call them. Efforts here you can see to try and maintain its augmetics, albeit they've had to be replaced with more durable industrial style augmetics on the left hand. Corruptive mutated flesh bursting out around it though, and a constant battle against rust and verdigris and disease being waged across the armour seeming crackling and decaying and then reforming with the vibrancy of the power of Nurgle. The battle cry then of the Withered Hand, I've decided, instead of the flesh is weak, it is all is rust. So those are the two models I've painted up for this. What would be really cool was if you wanted to give a go at this, I would love it if you painted up some models, perhaps your own Emperor's Children Success chapter, or your own World Eater Successor chapter if you've watched my previous video, or if you want to have a go at painting your own Plague Marine version of the Iron Hands, that would be really cool as well. Perhaps just throw it on Twitter, tag me in with, a hashtag like, I don't know, let's go with Shattered Mirror, hashtag Shattered Mirror, because the whole idea I have of this is it's a mirror universe of the 40k universe as we see it. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I really enjoy thinking about these, and I really enjoy putting a lot of time into kind of painting up the models for these. So I hope you've enjoyed it too. Next time, my plan is to do the Word Bearers and the Dark Angels. So I better get painting and converting for those two legions. But thanks very much for watching. As ever, I will catch you next time. Bye for now.